Your father didn't want this spoken about before he died. I stared at the man standing across from me, the salty breeze of the Pacific Ocean whipping my hair across my face. We were at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego, and the funeral was over. It was a remarkably small and quiet funeral, exactly the way my dad, Michael Donovan, lived his life. I am 35 years old, working as a financial auditor up in Seattle, and I always deal in facts, numbers, and logical explanations. But nothing about this exact moment made any logical sense to me. There was no crowd of weeping friends today. The service consisted entirely of me, a Navy chaplain who didn't actually know my dad, and 2 young honor guards who had just finished folding the American flag. There were no old military buddies sharing war stories, no display of medals, and definitely no grand eulogy honoring his service. To me, and to everyone else who knew him in his later years, my dad was just a simple, retired military man who lived a quiet, reclusive life after he left the service. He was a former Navy SEAL from Team 3, sure, but he never talked about it. He just fixed up old cars, drank cheap black coffee, and kept entirely to himself. As the chaplain packed up his Bible and the honor guards marched away toward their vehicle, I prepared to head back to my rental car and fly home. That was when the older man in the pristine uniform stepped out from the shadow of a nearby oak tree and walked directly toward me. I recognized the 4 gleaming stars on his shoulders immediately. He was an admiral, a very high-ranking one. Admiral Charles Whitaker. Judging by the gold-lettered name tag pinned perfectly to his chest, he didn't offer his condolences. He didn't shake my hand. He just looked at me with a serious, unreadable expression and delivered that opening sentence. Your father didn't want this spoken about before he died. Before I could even process what he was saying, the Admiral reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp, heavy-stock white card. He handed it to me. I looked down at it, expecting a military contact or a VA benefits office number. Instead, the card was almost entirely blank. It only had 2 things printed on it in elegant black ink, an international phone number and the name Hoffman Private Banking. I looked back up at the Admiral, completely confused. I don't understand. What is this? My dad didn't have a private bank account. He barely had a savings account. The Admiral ignored my confusion. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only I could hear him over the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs below. Fly to Zurich. Say the name Michael Donovan. They will understand. Zurich. Switzerland. I asked, my auditor brain completely short-circuiting. Admiral, my dad lived in a tiny 2-bedroom house in Tacoma. He drove a 15-year-old truck. Why would he have anything to do with a bank in Zurich? Just make the trip, Ms. Donovan, the Admiral said firmly. And without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing down the rows of white marble headstones. 2 days later, I was back in Washington State, pulling into the driveway of my dad's small, weathered house in Tacoma. The conversation at the cemetery had been playing on a continuous loop in my head. I hadn't slept well. The white card felt heavy in my pocket. I decided I needed to clear out the house, box up his meager belongings, and see if I could find anything that made sense of the Admiral's bizarre instructions. I spent the first few hours throwing out old newspapers and packing up his flannel shirts. It was all so painfully ordinary. But when I went out to the dusty, oil-stained garage to look through his tool chests, I noticed something odd about the concrete floor. Underneath an old, heavy workbench, a large rubber mat was glued down. It looked normal at a glance, but the edges were slightly peeled up. I grabbed a crowbar and wedged it under the mat, pulling it back with a hard yank. Underneath the mat, cut directly into the concrete foundation of the garage, was a heavy steel floor safe, and my heart started pounding against my ribs. I had known my dad my whole life, and I never knew this existed. Fortunately, I knew his habits. I punched in my mother's birthday on the electronic keypad. A red light flashed. I tried his enlistment date. Another red light. Then, I tried the date he formally retired from the Navy. The keypad beeped happily, turning green, and the heavy metal latch clicked open. I pulled the heavy lid back and stared down into the dark cavity. I honestly didn't know what I was expecting to find. Cash. Weapons. Instead, the contents were incredibly specific and strangely organized. First, I pulled out 3 different passports. They all had my dad's face on them, but only one had the name Michael Donovan. I fanned through the pages. They were completely covered with dozens of European entry and exit stamps, mostly from Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. I sat back on my heels, shocked. My dad had always told me he hated flying and never left the Pacific Northwest after his discharge. Next, I found a thick, leather-bound financial ledger. As an auditor, this immediately caught my attention. I opened it and saw rows upon rows of handwritten numbers, dates, and wire transfer routing codes. The sums were massive, but there were no names attached, only alphanumeric designations. Beneath the ledger was an old, faded photograph. It was a picture of my dad, looking much younger and rougher, standing in the desert with a group of heavily armed Navy SEALs. They were all smiling, covered in dust and sweat. To the very bottom of the safe lay a stack of folded topographical maps and a small, heavy-duty black USB drive. I unfolded the maps and spread them out on the garage floor. They were detailed military maps with specific, hand-drawn red circles and tactical coordinates marking various remote locations across Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. The USB drive looked like standard military encrypted hardware, the kind that required biometric or heavy software decryption to access. I sat alone in the quiet garage, surrounded by these hidden pieces of a life I knew nothing about. I was beginning to realize something profound and terrifying. My dad had hidden a tremendous amount of his life from me. He wasn't just a quiet old man fixing cars. He had been operating on a completely different level, keeping secrets that involved fake passports, hidden ledgers, and a 4-star Admiral. Before I could dig any deeper into the safe, the loud, grinding sound of an engine pulled into the driveway. A truck door slammed shut, and heavy footsteps approached the garage. It was my older brother, Jason. Jason walked in, looking exactly as stressed and disheveled as he had for the last 3 years. He smelled like stale cigarettes and cheap coffee. "Hey," he said, not really looking at me. "You started cleaning without me." "I just got here a few hours ago," I said, quickly standing up and casually kicking the rubber mat back over the floor safe so he wouldn't see it. Jason didn't notice. He was too agitated. He paced back and forth across the garage, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Did the old man leave anything?" he asked, getting straight to the point. "Any life insurance? Any hidden cash around here?" I looked at my brother, feeling a mix of pity and frustration. Jason was in deep financial trouble. His commercial construction company had recently filed for bankruptcy, and he was currently drowning in nearly $720,000 of debt. Creditors were calling him day and night, threatening to take his own house. "Jason, I haven't found a will yet," I told him carefully. "We need to sell this house, Claire." "Right now," Jason insisted, his voice rising with panic. "The market is hot. We can list it tomorrow, sell it as is, and split the cash as fast as possible." "I need the money. You know I need it." I watched him pace, his eyes darting around the garage as if hoping a bag of gold coins would suddenly fall from the ceiling. I thought about the 3 passports hidden under the floorboards. I thought about the intricate financial ledger. And most importantly, I thought about the crisp white card burning a hole in my pocket with the Swiss phone number printed on it. I made a split-second decision. I wasn't going to tell Jason anything. Not yet. He was too reckless, too desperate, and if there was something bigger going on, he would undoubtedly ruin it. I kept the secret of the Admiral's card locked tightly away in my mind. "I'll handle the probate and the house, Jason," I said calmly, using my best professional auditor voice to soothe him. "Just give me a few days to sort through his paperwork." As Jason grumbled and went inside to raid the refrigerator, I reached into my pocket and touched the edge of the white card. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. Jason left the house around 4 in the afternoon. I waited until I heard the grinding gears of his run-down truck fade down the street before I finally exhaled. I locked the front door, walked back into the kitchen, and sat down at the small, scratched Formica table. The house was dead quiet. I pulled the crisp white card from my pocket and placed it flat on the table in front of me. I just stared at the international number. As a financial auditor, I knew all about offshore accounts, wire transfers, and hidden assets. But my dad, the guy who clipped newspaper coupons for canned soup and wore the same 3 flannel shirts for a decade? It made absolutely zero logical sense. I checked the time. It was late afternoon in Washington state, which meant it was early morning the next day in Zurich. They would be open. I picked up my cell phone, punched in the international country code, and dialed the rest of the numbers. My palm was actually sweating. The phone rang twice. Then, a sharp click. Hoffman Private Banking. How may I direct your call? The woman's voice was crisp, professional, and carried a faint, polished European accent. I cleared my throat, trying to find my professional voice. Hi. I was told to call this number and say a specific name. Go ahead, please, she replied politely. Michael Donovan. The line went completely dead. For a second, I pulled the phone away from my ear, thinking the call had dropped or I had made a mistake. I put it back to my ear. I could hear very faint breathing, but the woman didn't say a single word. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. The silence was incredibly heavy. Hello? I asked, my grip tightening on the plastic casing of my phone. Are you still there? When the woman finally spoke again, her polite receptionist tone was entirely gone. Her voice was lower, incredibly serious, and laced with a strange weight I couldn't quite identify. Ms. Donovan, we have been waiting for this call for many years. A cold chill ran straight down my spine. Waiting? What do you mean you've been waiting? Who are you people? I am transferring you to the managing director's office now. Please hold. Another click. A brief moment of silence. Then a man's voice came on the line. He introduced himself as Henrik, a senior account manager. He didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't offer any condolences about my father's passing. He immediately gave me direct, precise instructions. Ms. Donovan, you need to come to Zurich. Bring your passport. Bring your father's original death certificate. And come as soon as possible. I have a job, I stammered, my auditor brain trying to pump the brakes. I can't just drop everything and fly to Switzerland. Tell me what this is about over the phone. I am his designated executor. We do not discuss client portfolios over the phone, Ms. Donovan. Not for an account of this nature. We will expect you within 72 hours. Safe travels. He hung up. I sat in my dad's kitchen for a long time, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator. I had a massive corporate audit report due at work on Friday. I had Jason breathing down my neck to sell the house so he could pay off his massive debts. I had a normal, predictable life. But I also had a floor safe hidden in the garage with fake passports, encrypted flash drives, and a ledger pointing to massive sums of money. I simply couldn't let it go. I needed the missing pieces. I opened my laptop, logged into a travel site, and booked a red-eye flight from Seattle to Zurich for the very next morning. I didn't tell Jason the truth. I sent him a quick text, saying I had an emergency corporate work trip to New York and that the probate process for the house would have to wait a week. He replied immediately with an angry paragraph about his creditors, but I ignored it. I packed a small suitcase, secured the heavy metal lid of the floor safe, rolled the rubber mat back over it, and dragged a heavy toolbox on top just to be safe. I locked the house up tight. The journey was exhausting. A flight to JFK, a long layover, and then an 8-hour jump across the Atlantic. I barely slept on the plane. My mind was racing, running through every possible scenario. Was my dad a criminal? A mercenary? Did he steal money during his SEAL deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan? The The topographical maps in the safe certainly suggested he had been operating in some very dangerous places. But the four-star Admiral at the funeral didn't fit the profile of a criminal enterprise. Admirals don't show up in full dress uniform to honor thieves. They show up to honor their own. But why the extreme secrecy? When I finally landed at Zurich airport, I was running on nothing but terrible airplane coffee and pure adrenaline. The city of Zurich was exactly what you would expect: impeccably clean, highly organized, and freezing cold. The crisp Swiss air hit my face as I grabbed a taxi outside the terminal. I handed the driver the address Henrik had emailed me right before I boarded my flight. We drove into the heart of the city, winding through streets lined with high-end boutiques, luxury watchmakers, and pristine architecture. The taxi eventually slowed down and pulled up to an old, imposing stone building right near the edge of Lake Zurich. The water of the lake was dark and glassy, reflecting the gray, overcast sky. I stepped out of the cab and looked at the building. There were no massive billboards, no glowing neon signs advertising checking accounts. There was only a small, highly polished brass plaque next to massive heavy oak doors that simply read, Hoffman. I took a deep breath, clutching my briefcase tightly against my chest. Inside that briefcase was my passport and my father's death certificate. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped inside. The interior didn't look anything like a bank. It looked like a luxury private club for billionaires. The floors were dark, spotless marble, the walls were paneled in rich mahogany, and the silence in the room was absolute. There were no teller windows, no lines of people, no ATM machines. Just a single, massive wooden reception desk. A man in a perfectly tailored suit stood up as I approached. "May I help you, madam?" "I'm Claire Donovan," I said, my voice sounding entirely too loud in the quiet room. "I have an appointment." The man's eyes flicked to a screen built flush into his desk. His posture immediately changed. "Ah, yes, Ms. Donovan. Please, provide your passport." I handed it over. He inspected it under a small blue light, verified the watermark, and typed something into his computer. Then, he pressed a button under his desk. A hidden door seamlessly opened in the mahogany paneling to my right. A security guard, dressed in a dark suit with a visible earpiece, stepped out. "Please follow him," the receptionist said, handing my passport back. The security guard didn't speak. I followed him through the hidden door and into a long, private corridor. The walls were incredibly thick, and I noticed at least 3 different camera lenses tracking us as we walked. We passed through 2 separate heavy steel doors that required the guard to use a biometric thumbprint scanner to open. Whatever was kept back here, it was guarded better than most military installations. Finally, we reached the end of the corridor. The guard opened a heavy oak door and gestured for me to enter. It was a closed, windowless meeting room. The only furniture was a long, polished conference table, large leather chairs, and a small sidebar with a silver coffee service. Sitting at the far end of the table was an older man with silver hair, wearing a dark blue suit that probably cost more than my dad's truck. He stood up as I walked in. "Ms. Donovan, I am Henrik. Please sit down." He gestured to the leather chair across from him. I sat down, placing my briefcase on the table. My hands were shaking slightly from the travel and the stress, so I kept them folded tightly in my lap. I watched as Henrik poured 2 cups of black coffee from the silver pot. He slid one slowly across the table to me. "I brought the death certificate," I said, eager to just get this over with. I unlatched my briefcase, pulled out the official piece of paper, and slid it toward him. Henrik didn't even look at the paper. He just left it sitting on the polished wood. He took a slow sip of his coffee, looking at me with intensely observant eyes. He seemed to be studying my face, looking for traces of my father in my features. "I have to ask," I said, unable to hold back my frustration any longer. "What is going on? Why did an admiral tell me to fly here? Why did your receptionist say you were waiting for my call?" My dad was a retired Navy SEAL who lived in a tiny house in Tacoma. He fixed old cars. He drank cheap beer. He didn't have a private Swiss banker. This has to be some kind of massive mistake. Henrik set his coffee cup down gently. The faint clink of porcelain echoed loudly in the quiet room. He folded his hands on the table and leaned forward slightly. "There is no mistake, Claire," Henrik said quietly. "Your father was many things, but above all else, your father was an extremely disciplined client." Henrik did not blink. He simply reached down into his expensive leather briefcase, pulled out a thick, black portfolio, and slid it carefully across the polished mahogany table toward me. I stared at it for a second before opening the cover. As a professional financial auditor, my entire life revolves around examining spreadsheets, cross-referencing bank statements, and verifying asset declarations. My brain is completely hardwired to ignore the fluff and scan directly for the bottom line. I flipped past the dense legal jargon, ignored the pages of Swiss banking bylaws, and went straight to the summary of assets page. My eyes immediately locked onto the bold black number printed at the absolute bottom of the right-hand column. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes, thinking the severe jet lag, the lack of sleep, and the terrible airplane coffee were finally making me hallucinate. I looked back down at the thick paper, but the number hadn't changed. $23,700,000. I actually let out a short, nervous laugh. It echoed strangely in the quiet, windowless room. I pushed the folder back toward the banker. "Henrik, this has to be a mistake. I'm telling you, you have the wrong Michael Donovan." My dad clipped 50-cent newspaper coupons to buy canned soup. He lived in a tiny, drafty house in Tacoma that barely cost $200,000. He drove a truck that sounded like it was going to explode every time he turned the key. He absolutely did not have $23 million. Henrik took another slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. His expression remained entirely neutral. "There is no mistake, Ms. Donovan. We have managed your father's private accounts for over 15 years. I assure you, every single cent of that $23.7 million belongs to the trust he established." My mind instantly flashed to my older brother, Jason. He was sitting back in Washington State right now, drowning in nearly $720,000 of debt because his commercial construction company went completely bankrupt. He was begging me just yesterday to sell our dad's house quickly so he could keep his head above water. And here I was, sitting in a highly secured Swiss bank vault, staring at enough liquid cash to solve every single financial problem our family had ever faced, 50 times over. "Okay," I said, pressing the palms of my hands flat against the table to stop them from shaking. "Okay. If this is real, how do I go about transferring it? I am the legally designated executor of his estate. I need to move these funds to a verified U.S. bank account so we can begin the probate process and clear out his assets." Henrik looked at me with a profound, almost heavy sense of calm. "You cannot do that, Claire, because this money is not for you. It is not for your family." I stopped breathing for a second. The silence in the room suddenly felt incredibly oppressive. "What do you mean it's not for us?" "Your father established a very specific, irrevocable, purpose-driven trust," Henrik explained, his voice smooth and precise. "The funds are strictly locked within our institution. They cannot be used for personal enrichment, real estate purchases for his descendants, or debt liquidation for family members. The legal parameters of the trust are extremely rigid." "If the money isn't for us," I asked, my voice rising slightly despite my best efforts to stay cool and professional, "then who exactly is it for?" Henrik opened the black folder again and flipped to a different tab near the back. He turned a large stack of papers around so I could read them from my side of the table. They were detailed disbursement logs. Hundreds of them, stretching back for years. "Your father directed us to use this fund for one specific purpose, to take care of the people left behind," Henrik said quietly. This money is used to pay for highly specialized surgeries for Navy SEALs who were severely injured in combat. It pays for comprehensive mental health treatments and rehabilitation for veterans suffering from severe PTSD. It covers aggressive, out-of-pocket oncology treatments for operators who developed rare cancers after being exposed to toxic burn pits overseas. And it fully funds the college tuitions for the children of SEALs who were killed in action. I sat there, completely paralyzed, staring at the pages of financial records. As an auditor, the numbers always told a story, and this story was overwhelming. As I read down the list, I saw massive wire transfers to state-of-the-art prosthetic clinics in Maryland, specialized trauma therapy centers in California, and pediatric oncology wards in Texas. Over 50 different families have received full financial support from this trust over the last decade, Henrik continued softly, pointing to a column of redacted names. And because of the strict privacy laws governing this Swiss institution, and the highly specific instructions your father gave us regarding absolute secrecy, none of those families have any idea who actually paid their medical bills or saved their homes from foreclosure. Total anonymity. Nobody knows who is behind it. Tears sharply pricked the corners of my eyes. I thought about the man who sat in his dusty garage every weekend, fixing old engines, completely alone. I always thought he had just checked out of life. I thought he was just a grumpy, isolated old man who didn't care about the world anymore. I was so incredibly wrong. He hadn't checked out at all. He had been quietly, systematically saving the lives of the men he served with, operating entirely from the shadows just like he did when he was on active duty. Why didn't he tell us? I whispered, almost to myself, staring blindly at the millions of dollars in medical payments. Why hide this from his own kids? Henrik reached into the inside breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single, sealed white envelope. I believe he wanted to explain that to you himself. He left this letter with me 5 years ago, with strict instructions to only hand it to you in person, inside this exact room after his passing. I took the envelope with shaking hands. My name was written on the front in my dad's messy, cramped, familiar handwriting. I slid my finger under the paper flap, tore it open, and pulled out a single sheet of yellow legal paper. Claire, the letter began. If you are reading this letter, it means you are the only one I trust to keep this fund going. I swallowed hard, the massive lump in my throat making it difficult to breathe. I wiped my eyes and kept reading. I know you are probably angry, he wrote. I know Jason is probably furious. But you need to understand the brutal world I came from. When my guys came home, the war didn't just stop for them. I watched men who gave absolutely everything for this country get torn apart by a system that didn't know what to do with them once they were broken. Many of my teammates were severely injured, completely lacking adequate support from the government, and facing massive financial hardships that were destroying their families. The handwriting got a little messier and darker toward the middle of the page, as if he had been pressing the pen down too hard against the paper in frustration. I made a lot of money doing private security contracting overseas after I left the teams. Blood money, really. I couldn't spend it on myself. I couldn't just sit in a nice house and buy a boat while the guys who covered my back in Fallujah and Ramadi were shooting themselves in their garages or dying of cancer because they couldn't afford out-of-network care. So I decided to help them silently. I wiped another tear that had escaped and rolled down my cheek, splashing onto the mahogany table. Jason is reckless, the letter continued. He always looks for the easy way out. If he knew about this money, he would blow it on failed businesses and fast cars within a year. But you, Claire, you are an auditor. You are incredibly smart, you are careful, and you have a moral compass that always points true north. The trust is yours to control now. The bank will follow your orders. Do what is right. Love, Dad. I slowly lowered the yellow paper. The absolute silence in the bank vault was deafening. My dad hadn't left me an inheritance. He had left me a massive, life-altering responsibility. Henrik was watching me quietly from across the table, giving me the necessary space to process the shock of what I had just learned. "So," I said, my voice cracking slightly. I cleared my throat, wiped my face, and tried again. "So, I am the sole controller of the trust now?" "Yes," Henrik nodded respectfully. "You have the final say on all financial disbursements. You approve the medical payments. You approve the tuition checks. You are the invisible hand now, Claire." I looked back down at the bank statement. $23.7 million. It was a staggering, terrifying amount of power to hold. And right at that exact moment, shattering the heavy silence of the room, my cell phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my brother, Jason. "Where are you? The bank in Seattle said you aren't in New York. You're in Switzerland. Call me now." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my stomach dropping. Jason had figured it out. He had tracked me down. My phone buzzed again immediately. Another text from Jason popped up on the screen. "What did the old man hide? How much money is there?" I looked at Henrik, then down at the yellow legal paper written by a ghost, and finally at the encrypted text on my screen. I was a professional auditor who always dealt in clear black and white, but I had just been dragged into the deepest, most complicated gray area of my entire life. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, my thumb hovering over the keypad. Jason had somehow tracked my location to Switzerland, completely blowing apart my cover story about being on a corporate audit trip in New York. I was sitting in a highly secured private bank vault in Zurich, holding a letter from our dead father, while staring at financial documents proving he had quietly amassed an absolute fortune. My phone buzzed again in my hand. It was another text from my brother. He was demanding to know exactly what our old man had hidden from us and how much money was sitting in the accounts. I looked across the polished mahogany table at Henrik, the Swiss banker who had just turned my entire understanding of my family upside down. Henrik didn't say a word. He just calmly sipped his coffee, watching me decide how to handle the sudden collapse of my secret. As a financial auditor, I have always believed that numbers do not lie, and that hiding the truth only compounds a problem. Jason was desperate, drowning in debt, and he was my brother. I decided not to lie to him anymore. I typed out a very simple, direct reply. 23 million. I didn't even have time to set the phone down on the table before it started ringing. It wasn't a text this time. Jason was calling me directly. I took a deep breath, swiped the screen to answer, and lifted the phone to my ear. "Are you out of your mind?" Jason's voice exploded through the speaker, so loud and sharp that I actually had to pull the phone an inch away from my head. $23 million? Claire, tell me you are joking right now. Tell me you didn't just find $23 million sitting in a Swiss bank account while I am literally about to lose my house. "I'm not joking, Jason," I said, keeping my voice as steady and low as possible. "But you need to listen to me very carefully. The money is here, but it is locked in a highly specific, irrevocable trust. It isn't our money." "What do you mean it isn't ours?" he yelled, the panic and greed mixing violently in his voice. "He was our father. We are his next of kin. Who else's money would it be?" I looked down at the disbursement logs sitting on the table, scanning the redacted names of the people my dad had been silently protecting. "He set it up to help other people, Jason. He used this money to pay for major surgeries for Navy SEALs who got severely wounded in combat. He's been paying for trauma therapy for veterans suffering from severe PTSD and covering the medical bills for guys dealing with cancer after they came home from the war. He even pays the college tuitions for the kids of his teammates who were killed in action." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. For a second, I thought maybe he was actually processing the incredible weight of what our father had done. I thought maybe, just maybe, he would feel the same sense of overwhelming pride and shock that I was feeling. I was completely wrong. He left tens of millions for strangers but didn't help his own family? Jason screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unfiltered rage. Are you kidding me, Claire? My construction company just went bankrupt. I owe the bank nearly 700 grand. I have creditors calling me at all hours of the night threatening to take everything I own, and my own father was sitting on $23 million and giving it away to strangers. They weren't strangers to him, Jason, I argued, my own temper starting to flare. They were his brothers. They were the men he bled with overseas. He saw that they weren't getting the help they needed from the government, so he stepped up and did it himself. He saved their lives. I don't care. Jason fired back. I am his actual blood. I am his son. You are the executor of the estate, Claire. You are an auditor. You know how to move money. You need to wire $1 million to my account right now to clear my debts, and then we split the rest. That is our inheritance. I can't do that, I said firmly, my voice turning cold. The trust is legally bound. And even if I could break it, I wouldn't. I am not going to steal medical funds from a wounded veteran to pay off your failed business loans. You are going to give me my cut of that money, Claire, or I am going to make your life a living hell, Jason threatened, his tone turning incredibly dark and vicious. Don't test me on this. He hung up. The line went dead. I sat there in the quiet vault, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at Henrik, who was quietly gathering the financial documents and sliding them back into his leather portfolio. My brother is not going to let this go, I told the banker honestly. Henrik nodded slowly. Money of this magnitude often changes the people we love. But remember your father's letter, Ms. Donovan. You have total control of the trust. The bank will only follow your direct orders. We will protect the assets, but you must protect the legal standing in your home country. I flew back to Seattle the very next day. The flight felt twice as long as the trip there. I was exhausted, stressed, and completely dreading the inevitable fallout. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 48 hours after I landed, I was sitting at my desk at the auditing firm, trying to catch up on my actual job, when a man in a cheap suit walked into my office and handed me a thick manila envelope. I had been officially served. Jason was suing me. I locked my office door, sat down, and pulled the legal documents out of the envelope. As I read through the aggressive legal jargon, my blood boiled. Jason wasn't just asking a judge to look at the estate, he was launching a full-scale legal assault against me. His lawyer had filed a massive civil suit, officially accusing me of intentionally hiding massive financial assets and orchestrating an unfair distribution of our father's inheritance. The lawsuit claimed that I had secretly colluded with a foreign bank to lock him out of his rightful money, and it demanded that the Swiss trust be immediately frozen and dismantled. It was a nightmare. The legal battle dragged on for months. It completely consumed my life. Every single week felt like a never-ending cycle of tense meetings with my own defense attorneys, aggressive discovery requests from Jason's legal team, and brutal, exhausting depositions. During the depositions, Jason sat across the conference table from me, glaring at me with absolute hatred. His lawyer aggressively questioned my professional integrity as an auditor. They tried to paint a picture of our father as a confused, aging man who didn't understand what he was doing with his finances. They argued that the trust was invalid because my father had secretly funneled money out of the country, and that, as his children, we were legally entitled to every single penny of that $23 million. I fought back with everything I had. I provided the courts with the detailed disbursement logs from Hoffman Private Banking, showing the exact medical facilities and tuition accounts that were receiving the money. I presented the handwritten letter my father had left me. But because the trust was completely anonymous and the Swiss banking privacy laws were so strict, it was incredibly difficult to definitively prove the original intent and the operational reality of the fund to a local judge in Washington state. Jason's legal strategy was simple but effective. Bleed me dry. He knew I didn't have the personal funds to sustain a massive, prolonged legal defense. He was hoping I would eventually cave under the financial and emotional pressure and just settle out of court by giving him a few $1 million to make the lawsuit go away. But he severely underestimated me. Every time I felt like giving up, I thought about the names on that ledger. I thought about the Navy SEALs who were relying on that money to survive. I refused to let my brother's reckless greed destroy the incredibly noble thing our father had built in the shadows. After 8 grueling months of endless legal motions, nasty emails, and shattered family ties, the judge finally set a date for the final binding hearing. This wasn't just a preliminary meeting. This was the day the court would decide whether to uphold the trust or completely dissolve it and hand the millions over to Jason. I walked into the courthouse on that rainy Tuesday morning feeling completely drained. My lawyer looked nervous. Jason was already sitting at the plaintiff's table, wearing a sharp suit he probably bought on credit, looking incredibly smug. He thought he had won. He thought he had backed me into a corner I couldn't escape from. I sat down at the defense table, organized my files, and took a deep breath. I knew the odds were heavily stacked against an anonymous offshore trust in a local probate dispute. But what Jason didn't know was that I had made a very specific phone call a few weeks prior. I had reached out to the only person who actually understood what my father was doing. I was just praying he would show up. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet. The judge, an older woman with severe glasses, looked over the massive stack of financial documents Jason's legal team had submitted. Jason sat across the aisle from me, leaning back in his chair with a smug, victorious expression. His expensive lawyer had just finished delivering a blistering closing argument, painting my father as a delusional old man who had illegally funneled his family's rightful inheritance into a shady offshore account. They had hammered the point that since the Swiss bank's records were completely anonymous, there was no solid proof that the $23 million was actually a charitable trust. Jason's lawyer claimed it was simply a hidden asset cache, and therefore, under Washington state law, it belonged to his children. My own lawyer, David, looked incredibly stressed. He shuffled his papers, knowing we were losing. We had the letter my dad wrote, but Jason's team had argued it wasn't a legally binding will. We had the bank ledgers, but they lacked specific recipient names. We needed something concrete to prove the absolute legitimacy of the trust. "Does the defense have any final witnesses before I make my ruling?" the judge asked, peering over her glasses at us. David stood up slowly, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we do have one final witness. He was delayed, but I believe he has just arrived." Jason let out a loud, mocking scoff. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer, who actually chuckled. They thought we were desperately stalling. Right at that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Every head in the room turned to look. Admiral Charles Whitaker walked down the center aisle. He wasn't wearing a civilian business suit. He was in his full, immaculate Navy dress uniform, his chest covered in rows of brightly colored ribbons and medals. The 4 silver stars on his shoulders caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. He walked with a terrifyingly calm, commanding presence. You didn't need to know military ranks to understand that a man of immense power had just entered the room. The smirk instantly vanished from Jason's face. He sat straight up, staring at the Admiral in pure confusion. His lawyer stopped chuckling and quickly started frantically flipping through his witness list, trying to figure out who this man was. I felt a massive wave of relief crash over me. I had called the Pentagon directory for weeks, navigating endless administrative hurdles, finally managing to leave a single, desperate message for Admiral Whitaker's office. I didn't actually know if he would come, but here he was. "State your name for the record," the bailiff said as the Admiral stepped up to the witness stand. "Charles Whitaker, Admiral, United States Navy," he said. His voice was deep, authoritative, and carried perfectly across the quiet room. The judge sat up a little straighter. "Admiral Whitaker, you are here to testify regarding the estate of Michael Donovan." "I am, Your Honor," Whitaker replied smoothly. He didn't look at Jason. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at the judge. I served with Michael Donovan many years ago. I am also intimately aware of his financial activities over the last decade and a half. David, my lawyer, stepped forward. Admiral, the plaintiff is claiming that Michael Donovan hid $23 million in a Swiss bank to deprive his family of an inheritance. Can you clarify the origin and the purpose of these funds? Admiral Whitaker leaned slightly toward the microphone. Michael Donovan was an elite operator. When he left the Navy, he transitioned into high-level private military contracting overseas. He operated in some of the most dangerous, hostile environments on the planet. He made a tremendous amount of money doing it, but he never considered that money his own. Why is that? David asked. Because Michael saw what was happening to the men who came back from those same war zones, the Admiral explained, his voice turning incredibly serious. He watched his teammates, men who had sacrificed everything for this country, get completely forgotten by the system. He saw Navy SEALs returning home with devastating physical injuries, severe traumatic brain injuries, and crippling PTSD. The government bureaucracy was too slow. The medical coverage was often inadequate. Men were losing their homes, their families, and in some tragic cases, their own lives, simply because they couldn't afford the specialized care they desperately needed. The courtroom was dead silent. Even Jason's lawyer had stopped shuffling his papers. Michael decided to fix the problem himself, Whitaker continued. He set up a highly secure, anonymous trust through Hoffman Private Banking in Zurich. He didn't want any recognition. He didn't want medals or thank-you letters. He simply wanted to save his brothers. That $23 million is not an inheritance. It is a lifeline. It pays for specialized surgeries, comprehensive mental health treatments, and college tuitions for the children of SEALs who were killed in action. Michael meticulously funded it, and he legally structured it so that nobody could ever touch it for personal gain. Jason couldn't handle it anymore. He jumped up from his chair, his face red with anger. He's lying. My dad fixed cars in his garage. He wasn't some secret millionaire saving the world. This is a setup to steal my money. Mr. Donovan, sit down and remain quiet, or I will have you removed from my courtroom immediately, the judge snapped, slamming her gavel down hard. Jason sank back into his chair, breathing heavily, but his eyes were darting around the room in panic. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. Jason's lawyer hesitantly stood up to cross-examine. He looked extremely intimidated. Admiral Whitaker, with all due respect, you claim this money is for charity. But we only have anonymous Swiss bank ledgers. How can we be certain that Michael Donovan actually intended for this money to remain completely inaccessible to his own flesh and blood? He was a wealthy man. Surely he wanted to leave something for his children. Admiral Whitaker turned his head slowly and locked eyes with Jason's lawyer. His gaze was absolutely piercing. Michael Donovan was not a rich man. He was a disciplined man, the Admiral said firmly, his words echoing in the silent room. He lived in a small house, drove a cheap truck, and lived a modest life by his own strict design. He had immense discipline. He knew exactly what he was doing with every single dollar he earned overseas. He established the trust with rigid legal parameters precisely to prevent anyone from dismantling his life's work to help the forgotten Navy SEALs after the war. I have reviewed the trust documents myself. I have personally met with several of the wounded operators who received anonymous medical funding from this exact account. The money is exactly where Michael intended it to be. The Admiral then reached into his uniform jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope with official Department of Defense markings. He handed it to the bailiff, who walked it up to the judge. Your Honor, those are sworn affidavits from 3 separate military medical liaisons, confirming that the anonymous wire transfers originating from the Hoffman Trust perfectly align with the paid medical invoices of severely wounded Navy SEALs. The paper trail is undeniable. The judge spent the next 10 minutes reading through the documents in complete silence. The tension in the room was so thick you could choke on it. I looked over at Jason. He was staring at the floor, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He knew it was over. You can argue against an anonymous offshore bank statement, but you cannot argue against a four-star admiral holding sworn military affidavits. Finally, the judge set the papers down and took off her glasses. She looked directly at Jason, and then at his lawyer. Her expression was completely devoid of sympathy. The court has reviewed the evidence, including the newly submitted affidavits and the highly credible testimony of Admiral Whitaker, the judge announced, her voice ringing out clearly. It is abundantly clear to this court that the funds held in Hoffman Private Banking were never intended to be part of the standard familial inheritance. Michael Donovan established a specific, irrevocable, and completely legal charitable trust for the medical support of military veterans. Jason let out a shaky breath, burying his face in his hands. The plaintiff's claims of hidden assets and unfair inheritance distribution are completely unfounded, the judge continued, raising her gavel. The trust is entirely legal and binding. Claire Donovan remains the sole executor and has full, unrestricted control over the management of the trust as outlined by her father. The plaintiff's lawsuit is hereby dismissed with prejudice. She slammed the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. It was over. After months of grueling, exhausting legal battles, after endless stress and anxiety, I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt heavy. I looked over at my brother. Jason was completely crushed. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to aggressive creditors, his business was dead, and he had just spent the last of his money fighting a losing battle against our dead father's legacy. He stood up slowly, ignored his lawyer, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. I stayed at the defense table, packing up my files. Admiral Whitaker walked over to me. He didn't smile, but his expression was noticeably softer than it had been at the cemetery a year ago. "You did well, Claire," the Admiral said quietly. "You protected the men. Your father knew exactly what he was doing when he chose you." "Thank you for coming, Admiral," I replied, genuinely overwhelmed with gratitude. "I couldn't have saved the trust without you." "Your father saved my life in Fallujah," Whitaker said simply. "Testifying in a civilian courtroom was the absolute least I could do. Now, it's your turn to take the wheel. The bank in Zurich is waiting for your orders." He gave me a crisp nod, turned, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving me completely alone with the heavy realization that the $23 million was now entirely my responsibility. The courtroom was empty, but the weight of the judge's ruling still pressed down heavily on my shoulders. I drove back to my apartment in Seattle that afternoon in complete silence. My phone was turned off. I didn't want to hear from my lawyer, and I certainly didn't want to hear from my brother. I walked into my kitchen, tossed my keys on the counter, and pulled out the thick black leather portfolio that Henrik had given me in Zurich. I spread the documents across my small dining table. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I was completely alone with the reality of the situation. I had won the lawsuit, which meant the Swiss trust was entirely legally binding and entirely under my control. The judge had made it absolutely clear during the ruling, I was the sole executor. In the eyes of the law, I had the ultimate authority. If I really wanted to, if I hired the right international lawyers and exploited the right banking loopholes, I technically had the power to dissolve the entire fund and keep the $23 million for myself. That thought sat in the back of my mind like a dark, heavy anchor. $23 million. It was enough money to quit my exhausting job, buy a mansion on the water, and never look at another corporate audit spreadsheet for the rest of my life. But then I looked at the disbursement ledgers. I ran my fingers over the redacted names of the Navy SEALs, the trauma clinics, and the oncology wards. I thought about the four-star admiral who had stood up in a civilian courtroom just to defend my father's honor. My dad hadn't left me a lottery ticket. He had left me a solemn duty. He trusted my moral compass. I knew, without a single shadow of a doubt, that I couldn't touch a single penny of that money for my own personal gain. I decided right then and there to continue my father's legacy. I opened my laptop, logged into the secure portal Henrik had provided, and officially authorized the next quarter's medical payments. The invisible hand was back to work. But making peace with the trust was only half the battle. I still had to deal with Jason. My brother had completely vanished after the trial. He didn't answer my texts, he blocked my phone number, and his lawyer had officially dropped him as a client due to unpaid legal fees. Jason had decisively lost the lawsuit, and with it, his last desperate hope of a quick financial bailout. I knew he was drowning. His commercial construction company was completely dead, and the bank was actively moving to foreclose on his house. 3 weeks after the court date, I finally drove down to Tacoma. I didn't call ahead. I just pulled up to his house and parked behind his beat-up truck. The front lawn was overgrown, and there was a bright orange foreclosure notice taped violently to the front door. I knocked hard. It took 5 minutes of relentless pounding before the door finally unlocked and swung open. Jason looked terrible. He had lost weight, his eyes were bloodshot, and he smelled like cheap beer and stale sleep. He glared at me, his hand gripping the edge of the door. "What do you want, Claire?" he rasped, his voice dripping with exhaustion and bitterness. "You won. You got the money. You proved I'm an idiot in front of a judge. Are you here to gloat?" "I'm here to help you," I said flatly, pushing past him and walking directly into the living room. The house was a disaster. There were unpaid bills and final collection notices scattered everywhere. Jason let out a harsh, sarcastic laugh and slammed the front door shut. "Help me? Oh, right. Let me guess. You're going to write me a check for $1 million now that the lawyers are gone? You suddenly felt guilty about keeping all the old man's cash." "No," I replied, turning around and looking him dead in the eye. "I am not giving you $1 million, Jason. I am not giving you a single massive payout so you can go start another reckless business and lose it all again." His face immediately flushed with anger. "Then get the hell out of my house." "Sit down and listen to me," I fired back, my voice rising with an authority I didn't even know I had. I was done treating him like a fragile victim. I am an auditor. I fix broken financials for a living. I have looked over your bankruptcy filings. You are in a massive hole, but it is not entirely inescapable if you actually use some discipline. I am offering you a choice right now. Jason crossed his arms, leaning against the wall, but he didn't kick me out. He was too tired to fight. "I will not hand you cash," I explained, pulling a detailed, printed spreadsheet out of my bag and tossing it onto his cluttered coffee table. "But I have drafted a highly controlled debt repayment plan. I will use my own personal savings, not the trust money, to pay off the immediate aggressive creditors who are threatening to take this house. In exchange, you are going to agree to strict financial counseling. You are going to let me oversee your accounts, and I am going to provide you with step-by-step support to rebuild your credit." Jason stared at the spreadsheet on the table like it was a venomous snake. His pride was massively wounded. He had spent the last year screaming that he was entitled to an enormous, multi-million-dollar inheritance, and now his younger sister was offering him a strict financial allowance and mandated therapy. "You want to put me on an allowance," Jason sneered, shaking his head in disgust. "You want to control my life. You want to act like you're the smart, responsible one while treating me like a child. I want to keep you from living in your truck, Jason," I yelled, finally losing my patience. "Dad didn't leave us the money because he knew you would blow it, and he was right. This is the only offer you are going to get. Take the structured help or lose the house. It's entirely up to you." Jason didn't say a word. He just turned his back to me and walked into the kitchen. He initially refused the offer completely. He told me to leave and never come back. I didn't argue. I just left the spreadsheet on the table, walked out the front door, and drove back to Seattle. I knew I couldn't force him to accept reality. He had to hit absolute rock bottom on his own terms. For the next few months, I focused entirely on my dual life. By day, I was a corporate auditor navigating mundane tax documents. By night, I was the sole controller of the Hoffman Private Trust, working closely with Henrik in Zurich to quietly fund life-saving medical treatments for veterans across the country. I received anonymous, heavily redacted updates from the clinics. I saw the impact. I saw young men learning to walk again with state-of-the-art prosthetics that the trust had fully paid for. I saw families saved from total ruin. It was incredibly fulfilling, but the silence from my brother remained a sharp, painful ache. Then, late one rainy Tuesday night, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jason. It was just 2 words. "I'm ready." After many brutal months of dodging creditors and facing the very real, terrifying prospect of total homelessness, his stubborn pride had finally broken. He finally accepted the help. The next day, we sat down at a sterile table in a local bank branch. I didn't smile, and I didn't say, "I told you so." I simply opened my laptop, pulled up his credit accounts, and we started the grueling, humiliating process of negotiating his debts. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a sudden, magical fix. It was a slow, agonizing crawl out of a massive financial grave. But for the first time in years, my brother was actually listening to me. He sat there, quietly writing down the budget I assigned him. He didn't argue. He didn't demand more. It was going to take years to clean up his mess. But as I watched him sign his name on the first debt consolidation agreement, I felt a strange sense of peace. I realized that my father's extreme discipline had finally bled into our lives. It had been exactly 1 year since the judge slammed her wooden gavel down and completely ended the absolute worst chapter of our family's history. 365 days had passed since I officially became the sole executor and silent guardian of the Hoffman Private Trust. My life over the last 12 months had split into 2 entirely different realities. By day, I was still Claire Donovan, the 35-year-old financial auditor living in Seattle, drinking mediocre office coffee and grinding through endless corporate tax spreadsheets. I kept my job, my small apartment, and my completely average, predictable routine. I didn't buy a new car. I didn't upgrade my wardrobe. I lived exactly the same way I always had, because that was the absolute core of my father's message. The $23 million sitting in that highly secured Swiss bank vault wasn't mine to spend, and I refused to touch a single penny of it for my own personal comfort. But by night, my reality shifted entirely. After I locked my apartment door and opened my heavily encrypted laptop, I became the invisible hand my father had trained me to be. I spent my evenings coordinating with Henrik in Zurich, carefully reviewing medical invoices and authorizing massive wire transfers. Over the past year, I had personally overseen the financial disbursements for a dozen different severely wounded operators. I authorized full payments for a state-of-the-art robotic prosthetic arm for a former Navy SEAL living in Texas. I completely paid off the outstanding medical debts for a veteran in Ohio who was undergoing aggressive chemotherapy after being exposed to toxic burn pits overseas. And just 2 weeks ago, I signed the digital paperwork to fully cover the 4-year university tuition for a young girl whose father was killed in action during a raid in Afghanistan. I never met any of these people. I never heard their voices. The bank's strict privacy protocols ensured absolute anonymity. They just woke up one day to find their crushing financial burdens completely erased. It was exhausting, heavy work, but it was the most profound thing I had ever done in my entire life. The other half of my year was spent dealing with Jason. When I offered him the strict, highly controlled debt repayment plan right after the brutal lawsuit, he initially told me to go to hell. But reality is a vicious teacher. When the bank finally foreclosed on his house in Tacoma and his creditors started aggressively freezing his personal checking accounts, his stubborn pride finally shattered. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. He swallowed his anger, called me late one night, and agreed to my terms. It was a brutally difficult process. We sat down every single Sunday night for a mandatory financial review. I made him cut up every single credit card he owned. I forced him to take a grueling, physically demanding job as a standard foreman on a commercial construction site, working 60 hours a week just to earn a basic paycheck. For the first 6 months, he hated me. He resented the strict budget, the mandated financial counseling, and the complete loss of his independence. We fought constantly, but I didn't back down. I used the exact same unyielding discipline our father had used. Slowly, agonizingly, things began to shift. As Jason watched his massive debts incrementally shrink each month, his anger was replaced by a quiet, grim determination. He stopped complaining about the long hours at the construction site. He stopped talking about getting rich quick. He started to understand the value of a single, hard-earned dollar. We weren't best friends, but the toxic, explosive hatred that had defined our relationship during the lawsuit was finally gone. We were rebuilding, brick by brick. Which brought us to this exact moment. 1 year later. We were driving down the winding, sun-baked roads of the Point Loma Peninsula in San Diego, heading straight toward Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. I was behind the wheel of our cheap rental car, and Jason was sitting in the passenger seat, staring quietly out the window at the deep blue waters of the Pacific Ocean. Neither of us had spoken much since our flight landed. This was the first time we had returned to this cemetery since the incredibly bizarre, lonely funeral where Admiral Whitaker had first handed me that crisp white card. I parked the car in the visitor lot. The weather was perfect, a crisp 70 degrees with a steady, salty ocean breeze whipping through the trees. We got out of the car and started walking. The cemetery was vast, a sprawling ocean of perfectly aligned white marble headstones standing at strict attention against the bright green grass. The absolute silence of the place was heavy and respectful. Jason walked a few paces ahead of me. He looked vastly different than he had a year ago. The cheap, flashy suits were gone, replaced by a simple, faded flannel shirt and work boots. He had lost the bloated, stressed look in his face. He looked older, tired, but remarkably grounded. We navigated through the specific rows and sections until we reached the area dedicated to the veterans of the recent conflicts. I stopped, my chest tightening slightly as I looked down at the simple white marble stone. Michael Donovan, United States Navy. There were no long, poetic epitaphs. There were no lists of his covert deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, or Somalia. The stone didn't mention the $23 million, the private Swiss bank, or the dozens of lives he had quietly saved from the shadows. It was just his name, exactly as he would have wanted it. I stood next to Jason, the salty wind blowing my hair across my face. We stood there in complete silence for a very long time, just staring down at the carved letters. I thought about the heavy floor safe hidden under the rubber mat in his dusty garage. I thought about the encrypted USB drives, the fake passports, and the thick ledgers. I had spent my entire childhood thinking my dad was just a quiet, emotionally distant man who cared more about fixing old truck engines than engaging with the world. I had been so incredibly blind to the massive burden he was carrying entirely by himself. Jason let out a long, slow breath. He shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his jeans and stared at the white marble. "I used to think he did nothing after leaving the service," Jason said softly, his voice cracking slightly against the wind. The bitterness that usually accompanied any mention of our father was completely gone. In its place was a profound, heavy sense of awe and regret. I used to look at him sitting in that garage, drinking cheap coffee, and I thought he was just a failure. I thought he had just given up on life and left us with absolutely nothing. I had no idea who he really was. I reached out and placed my hand firmly on my brother's shoulder. I squeezed it gently, feeling the solid muscle he had built working on the construction site over the last year. "He didn't give up on anyone, Jason," I replied quietly, looking down at the grave. "He just fought a different kind of war when he came home. And he is still helping them." Jason nodded slowly, accepting the absolute truth of those words. He didn't ask about the money. He didn't ask how much was left in the Swiss accounts or who the latest recipients were. He finally understood that it wasn't our money to ask about. It never was. A strong gust of wind swept across the peninsula, rushing through the long, perfectly straight rows of white headstones. The wind caught the small, vibrant American flags that had been carefully planted next to the graves, making them snap and flutter loudly in the quiet afternoon air. I closed my eyes and listened to the sound of the snapping flags and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the cliffs below. The entire journey of the last 12 months washed over me. The shock of the Swiss bank, the brutal legal battle, the crushing weight of the responsibility, and the painful, slow reconciliation with my brother. My father, Michael Donovan, had intentionally designed this exact outcome. His ultimate legacy to us wasn't a massive pile of cash. He knew that simply handing us millions of dollars would have completely destroyed us. It would have amplified Jason's worst, most reckless traits, and it would have ruined my own sense of purpose. Instead, he left us the hardest, most valuable thing he could possibly pass down. He left us his unbreakable discipline. I opened my eyes, gave Jason's shoulder one last squeeze, and turned to walk back toward the car. The invisible hand was still working, and I had a long flight back to Seattle to catch. 5 years had passed since that quiet, windy afternoon at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery, where Jason and I had stood over our father's grave and finally understood that his true legacy was never about money, but about absolute, unyielding discipline. A lot of things can change in half a decade, but the most important things in my life had remained remarkably constant. I was 40 years old now, but I was still Claire Donovan, working as a highly dedicated financial auditor at the exact same firm in Seattle. I still drove a thoroughly average car, lived in the same comfortable but modest apartment, and dealt with standard corporate tax spreadsheets during the day. Nobody at my firm had any idea that when I went home and locked my front door, I logged into a highly encrypted portal to communicate with Hoffman Private Banking in Zurich. I was still the sole executor and the invisible hand behind the massive private trust my father, Michael Donovan, had secretly built after retiring from Navy SEAL Team 3. The fund, which had originally held $23.7 million, was still actively operating in the shadows. Henrik, the Swiss banker who had first shown me the overwhelming reality of my father's hidden life, had recently retired, but the new account manager followed the exact same strict privacy protocols. Every single month, I received a heavily encrypted file containing new, completely redacted medical invoices and funding requests. And every single month, I authorized the wire transfers to pay for them. Over the last 5 years, the impact of the trust had expanded significantly. My father had originally helped over 50 families before his death, but that number had easily tripled under my watch. We were still aggressively funding specialized, high-cost surgeries for Navy SEALs who had been severely wounded in combat. We were fully covering the massive out-of-pocket expenses for veterans suffering from severe PTSD and aggressive cancers linked to their deployments. Just last week, I signed off on the full 4-year college tuition for a young man whose father had been killed in action in Afghanistan, ensuring he would graduate entirely debt-free. It was an enormous responsibility, but the strict anonymity of the trust remained entirely unbroken. None of the recipients ever knew who was actually paying their bills. Managing this secret life always made me think back to the shocking days after the funeral, when I had first pried open that hidden floor safe in my dad's dusty garage. I still clearly remember the intense confusion of finding the 3 fake passports covered in European stamps, the encrypted military USB drive, and the tactical maps covered in hand-drawn coordinates marking remote locations across Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia. I had been so terrified back then, completely unable to reconcile the image of my quiet, coupon-clipping father with the reality of a covert operator sitting on a $23 million fortune. But the hardest part of that entire journey hadn't been uncovering the Swiss bank account, it had been the brutal fallout with my older brother. Jason was a completely different man today, but 5 years ago, he had been drowning in nearly $720,000 of debt after his commercial construction company completely collapsed into bankruptcy. When he found out about the $23 million, He had been consumed by desperation and greed, furious that our father had left tens of millions for strangers while his own family struggled. Jason had sued me, launching a grueling legal battle that lasted for months, officially accusing me of intentionally hiding assets and orchestrating an unfair distribution of our inheritance. He had tried to break the trust and take the money for himself. I would have lost that lawsuit entirely if Admiral Charles Whitaker hadn't walked into the courtroom in his full dress uniform. I still thought about the Admiral's testimony often. He had looked the judge dead in the eye and stated that Michael Donovan was not a rich man, but a highly disciplined one, and that he had legally established the fund specifically to help the forgotten Navy SEALs who were abandoned by the system after the war. Because of the Admiral's sworn testimony, the court ruled that the trust was completely legal, giving me full, unrestricted control, and Jason had completely lost the case. That crushing legal defeat had been the absolute rock bottom my brother needed to survive. After the lawsuit, I had offered Jason a very difficult choice: a highly controlled debt repayment plan, strict financial counseling, and step-by-step support to rebuild his life, or nothing at all. He had stubbornly refused at first, angry at the strict parameters, but after months of facing complete financial ruin, he finally accepted my terms. Today, Jason was completely debt-free. It had taken him 4 brutal, exhausting years of working massive overtime as a heavy machinery operator and living on an incredibly tight, strictly monitored budget, but he had actually done it. He hadn't just paid off his creditors, he had fundamentally rewired his entire brain. He no longer looked for easy payouts or reckless business ventures. He lived simply, quietly, and deliberately. Jason came over to my Seattle apartment for dinner on a rainy Thursday night. We sat at my small kitchen table, eating takeout pizza and drinking cheap beer, looking remarkably like our dad used to. The animosity that had poisoned our relationship during the lawsuit was entirely gone. "I drove past the old house in Tacoma today," Jason mentioned casually, taking a slice of pizza. "The new owners painted it blue. Looks weird." "Dad would have hated a blue house," I smiled, shaking my head. "He would have said it draws too much attention." Jason laughed, a genuine, relaxed sound that used to be incredibly rare. "Yeah, he definitely preferred blending into the background. Sometimes I still can't believe how well he played us. Sitting in that garage every weekend, fixing that old truck, acting like the most boring man on the planet, while secretly wiring millions of dollars to trauma clinics across the country. It's insane." He wrote in his last letter that he needed to help them silently. I reminded him, thinking about the handwritten note Henrik had given me in Zurich, where Dad had explicitly stated I was the only one he trusted to keep the fund going. He didn't want the medals or the recognition. He just wanted to make sure his guys survived the peace. Jason took a slow sip of his beer, looking out my apartment window at the rain-slicked streets of Seattle. "When we were standing at his grave a few years ago, I told you I used to think he did absolutely nothing after he left the service. I really believed he was just a burned-out old man. I was so angry at him for so long." "I know you were," I said softly. "You told me that day that he was still helping his men." Jason continued, turning back to look at me. "But you were wrong, Claire. He wasn't just helping his teammates. He was helping us, too. If he had just dumped a few $1,000,000 into my checking account when my company went bankrupt, I would have blown it all within a year. I would have learned absolutely nothing, and I would probably be dead or in jail right now. He knew exactly what he was doing by locking us out of that money." I smiled, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settle over the room. Jason had finally grasped the core truth that our father had tried to teach us through his extreme actions. The $23 million was a tool to save his brothers in arms, but the absolute secrecy and the rigid parameters of the trust were the tools he used to save his own children. "He gave us discipline," I said quietly, echoing the exact realization we had shared at the cemetery. "He gave us the only thing that actually mattered," Jason agreed, raising his beer bottle slightly in a silent toast. Later that night, after Jason had gone home to his own modest apartment, I cleaned up the kitchen and sat down at my desk. The apartment was completely silent, filled only with the faint sound of the Seattle rain hitting the window panes. I opened my encrypted laptop, typed in the complex series of passwords, and logged back into the Hoffman private banking server. A new file of approved medical disbursements was waiting for my final signature. I looked at the redacted names on the screen. Another veteran getting a prosthetic. Another family getting their medical debts cleared. I thought about my father, a rough, quiet Navy SEAL who had seen the absolute worst of humanity in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but who had chosen to spend the rest of his life quietly repairing the damage. I pressed the approval key, authorizing the wire transfer, and watched the digital numbers deploy into the world to save another life. The invisible hand was still working, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never let it stop.